right. Now we're going to change directions considerably and begin to look at social movements and discussion, social movements and some discussion of those. And we have two speakers. First, Craig Reinarmen, who's an Emeritus Professor of Sociology and Legal Studies at University of California, Santa Cruz. And then we'll be followed by Francesca Paletta, who's Professor of Sociology at the University of California, Irvine. So I assume these people are the folks who think that California has the best systems. Francesca is going to be talking to us remotely, and then we'll, as before, whichever you prefer, wherever you're more comfortable. Yes, I think so. Or you can face it from up there, whatever, or from the podium, wherever you're most comfortable. Great.
Someone's going to give me a clicker. Well, thank you very much for your gracious invitation to be part of these proceedings. I'm not at all sure that what I have to say fits very well, but when I got the call and the invitation, I immediately objected that I hadn't thought about this stuff in 30 years, and that there were real experts out there and a very thick literature that you should, and I was reassured that all those experts would be here and I didn't have to worry about that. And that the committee thought it might be valuable to hear about the historical context of prior success, particularly with MAD, and compare that to the current context, and that might provide some useful ideas. So that's the idea here. I began my research 30 plus years ago on MAD at the encouragement of Robin Room. I was a postdoc at Berkeley, the Alcohol Research Group. And I started with the curious fact that the existence of tens of thousands of tragic deaths each year, year after year, thought to be caused by drunk driving, was not a sufficient condition for it to be defined as a social problem, officially defined as a social problem. DUI fatalities were always awful, and NHTSA and other groups had tried, but they simply didn't get it onto the front page on the front burner. Nor was MAD brought into being, as you all know, I'm sure, by any sudden rise in DUI or DUI fatalities. In fact, one of MAD's core original complaints was precisely that DUI offenders were not taken seriously by police, by the courts, and by policymakers, that offenders routinely got slaps on the wrist. And MAD argued that police, judges, and policymakers too often thought, well, most people drink, and there's not very good public transportation in the U.S., and so there, but for the grace of God, go I. And so drunk driving was sort of thought of as a folk crime, what Gusfield called a folk crime, done by good citizens. And so there wasn't much in the way of punishment or deterrence and so forth. So if I thought in the beginning, if drinking and driving has been a problem widespread for a long time, and if NHTSA and other well-intentioned folks have tried what they could without really getting any success, then how come MAD managed to do that? Why did it succeed when it did, and what can we learn from that? And the punchline of my paper, which I think you all have in a packet, was basically that there was a synergistic interaction between the credibility of the claims makers and the features of the historical context in which they made their claims. Starting with the perfect victim. You excuse the expression, an innocent child is walking home from school on a warm spring day and is run over and killed. Every parent's nightmare. You had the perfect villain, a repeat offender, an alcoholic, drunk in the middle of the day, on probation, in fact, out on bail from a previous offense, a recent DUI arrest, undeterred by prior convictions, and seemingly indifferent to the consequences of his actions. And notice, just by the way, that Matt initially chose MAD, stood for Mothers Against Drunk Drivers, not drunk driving. And that was a deliberate choice of focus because it constricted the aperture of attribution to the lone deviant who made the choice to drink and drive. And that very shrewdly sort of pushed off the table structural sources of the problem and, in effect, was pleasing to the industry, the alcohol industry, related complex of alcohol industries, really, their narrative. So what was a potentially very powerful opposition all of a sudden is on board. And this framing of the problem was very crucial. Thirdly, you had, in effect, a perfect moral entrepreneur. Who could be more credible to make these claims than a grieving mother, Candy Lightner? Her efforts initially met with indifference, from policymakers, and she turned those frustrations into more arguments that she was able to use very effectively to bring more people on board. She gave dramatic press conferences, tearful testimony on talk shows and in legislatures, and as one media scholar put it, quote, "No sane director will pass up a grieving, sobbing mother. It was the start of an orgy of attention for MAD." So more media attention led to more resources, a NHTSA grant to start more chapters, a foundation support. The National Association of Broadcasters launched a public service campaign that echoed a lot of what MAD was doing. Just as a footnote, I would add that it helped them forestall a ban on very lucrative advertising of alcohol. All of this helped MAD attract yet more volunteers, start more chapters, and get more funding in a kind of virtuous circle that sociologists sometimes call a resource mobilization theory. And then fourthly, I want to call it the perfect moment. And I want to suggest that the historical context was a crucial ingredient in this success. MAD's claims were in harmony with the zeitgeist. And here's what I mean. The late 70s saw the rise of Jerry Falwell and his moral majority bringing conservative Christian constituencies out into the public sphere when their tendency prior to him had been to say, that's them, we'll stay among ourselves. And also at almost exactly the same moment, the tax revolt, property tax revolt in California, arguably the Concord and Lexington of the anti-government right, these two events. Secondly, the philosophical heart of the post-Watergate renascent right was individual responsibility. It was the recurring answer given to all problems, crime, welfare, racial disadvantage, and a long list of other things. There was greater punitiveness all across the policy board under Reagan and Meese. They wanted to reduce judicial discretion. They wanted to eliminate plea bargaining. They wanted to lengthen sentences. They wanted to get rid of these pesky constitutional requirements for procedural protections for people who were charged. And so that was a piece of the context as well. MAD made deft use of a mass mail firm that specialized in political marketing and mobilization of family values voters and other conservative Christian constituencies. MAD billed itself as the voice of the victim, and still does. And so its claims fit snugly alongside the victims' rights movement, which was also growing at the time and was encouraged by the Reagan administration. And again, the policy goal there was pushing for more certain and more severe punishment for a variety of crimes. And more broadly, there was a kind of resurgence of conservative reaction against the perceived permissiveness of the 1960s, liberalism in general. And Nixon had ridden that into office. His law and order was a core theme of his campaign. I'm sure some of you will remember. And it got derailed, of course, by Watergate. But MAD struck a responsive chord in a context marked by those sorts of features. And the result, as you've heard today as well, um, was explosive growth of MAD as a social movement organization. 360 chapters in all 50 states, 600,000 members. I'm sure this is larger now, but $10 million budget within a few years. And that put floodlights on the issue of DUI. DUI had become hot. And you all know very well, better than I do, about what the results were and what the impact was. All states raising the drinking age, server training, general public education. And I would add, we haven't talked much today about changing the culture. When you think of the campaign, Friends Don't Let Friends Drink and Drive, the widespread adoption of designated drivers that's just become part of common sense for millions of people, drink responsibly campaigns from the industry. All of this, it seemed to me, MAD helped facilitate, as the historical context in which MAD arose helped facilitate them. So within 5 years, you had all these new laws in every state, per se standards, lower BAC limits, and stiffer penalties. And as you saw in that wonderful chart, dramatic decline and sustained decline in DUI fatalities. So I come to now the current context. What's going on now? What's similar and what's different? And it seems to me there are similarities. The conservatives are now in power in all three branches of government, and there's some ideological similarity. Clear majority of state houses. The core constituencies in the red states are similar to those in the 1980s. And many of those constituencies seem to have similar fears and resentments. So you might expect on that basis a similarly hospitable historical context. But I think there are several key differences. The first is that the conservative context then is not exactly the same as the conservative context now. The right has moved far right. The Tea Party has greater animosity toward all sorts of federal action. The Freedom Caucus opposes its own party's repeal and replace healthcare bill as too generous. In the 1980s, policymakers were expanding treatment for alcohol and drug problems. But now with the repeal of the Affordable Care Act and sharp cuts in Medicaid and NIH funding, there seems to be some serious risk of things moving in the other direction. There will be less support and less funding for that. So you could say something similar about the safety net that keeps some people from skidding out of control. The safety net is being weakened, if not shredded, and that may increase aggregate vulnerability to drug and alcohol problems. And you could make a similar point about the current context with regard to auto safety regulations. You have a regime that is fundamentally anti-science, and so lots of things that researchers value and necessary data sets, funding for important research, seems to me is now politically imperiled alongside the undoing of federal regulations. So yes, there was a new right coming to power when MAD took off and had its success, but it's a different and more extreme right now in power, and that makes for a different political conjuncture that may not be as hospitable. It's too soon to tell, I think. A second thing I would point to that's a difference is that criminal justice policies, unlike 1980, seem to be headed in a different direction. We appear to be at an inflection point with regard to criminal justice. In 1980, beginning then, you had Reagan and the rise of the new right, followed by Bush 1 and the crack era laws, and then Clinton adding more tough laws, more cops, more lines of funding. And what you got in the end was a mass incarceration crisis. Um, and here I'll just give you one slide. These are incarceration rates, the number of people in prison per 100,000 population. And the United States is far and away the winner. And our incarceration rates are somewhere between 5 and 10 times higher than all of the comparable industrialized democracies that we compare ourselves to. Um, Canada, England, France, Italy, Australia, you name it. And this wasn't always true in the United States. From 1925, I think it was, when they started collecting data, through 1975, through Richard Nixon, the incarceration rate was more or less stable at around 100, 125 per 100,000 population. And then all of a sudden, in 1980, you started to see this extraordinary rise, having a lot to do with the crack era laws, but not only that. And I mention this in part because this was all fuel to the fire of criminal justice reform movement and drug policy reform, which I'll get there in a minute. So we now see something like a bipartisan consensus. It's really literally a rare thing on both sides of the aisle. People talking about sentencing reform, and you have an agreement, majoritarian agreement, that mass incarceration has been an extremely expensive means of making people less able to live drug-free, crime-free lives. About 30 states have passed drug policy reforms and other criminal justice reforms. California, for example, a sharp reduction, court-ordered in numbers sent to state prison, shorter sentences. Even in many red states, you see resources being shifted away from jail and prison toward rehabilitation and community services. Minor drug offenses have been reduced to misdemeanors in various states. These are reforms that are supported not just by the usual liberal humanitarian suspects, but by conservatives that are worried about the size and scope and the cost of the state, and the lack of effectiveness for all that money of more punishment, sometimes called humanitarians. Now, of course, this is subject to change with the new administration. But at the state level, at least, there has been a shift away from punishment-based policies that may have implications for the new DUI policies being contemplated. Well, speaking of reforms, the punitiveness of the 1980s and the rise of mass incarceration in its wake were also key sources of the drug policy reform movement. That's also part of a new conjuncture, I would say. One way to start this would be the rise of syringe exchange programs as a way to prevent the spread of AIDS, HIV/AIDS. You have, in short order, more social movement organizations, Drug Policy Alliance, Marijuana Policy Project, the National Organization for Reform of Marijuana Laws, Students for Sensible Drug Policy, and the list goes on. They have more members, more funding, more media than ever before. They push, too, for treatment instead of jail. They've accomplished medical marijuana laws in 29 states and counting. They have repealed the Rockefeller drug laws in New York. They've achieved legalization of cannabis for recreational use in 8 states and the District of Columbia. And I've not done a systematic review of the studies on how these changes have affected highway safety, but I have seen a few studies that, the increase in availability and the predictions at the time that the first medical marijuana law passed in California in 1996 were that the sky would fall. And it hasn't. Use of marijuana among young people fell for 10 years after it passed. We'll see what happens with the new legalization measure. We can go into that, and a lot of people in the room know more about this sort of thing than I do. But I lived part of the year in Amsterdam, and for many years, this was the only natural experiment in the world about how people respond when you don't get arrested and thrown in jail for possession of this drug, but rather you can't throw a brick without hitting a place that sells it legally. Well, it turns out that their prevalence rates are about half of what they are in the United States. So one of the inferences that's drawn from the Dutch experience really is that availability is not destiny. It's not that these drugs will just grab a hold of a certain percentage of the population and have their way with these people. Uh, it, the law is important, but culture is equally important. I can go into that in more detail if you like. But my biggest worry, getting to the end here, my biggest worry about new DUI policies is to the extent that they're based on stronger sanctions. Ultimately, there's a sort of punishment logic underneath it that ultimately you have to get to. And to put the point bluntly, if new laws that are punishment-based that have to do with DUI are not used in a discriminatory manner for the social control of the dangerous class du jour, it will be the first such law that's not been used in that way. I can give you a few quick slides to show you what I mean. Oops, I reviewed some of this. This was about a little bit about the drug policy reform movement. I can go back to this if you like. These are 25 of the largest, most populous counties. The black line on these bars, the percent of the county population black, and the red line, the percent of marijuana possession arrests that are black. And as you can see, in virtually every county, whether they make few arrests down the bottom or many arrests at the top, the racial disparity is a constant. Sometimes it's double, sometimes it's triple, sometimes it's a little less than half, but it's always there. It depends on who's being surveilled, who's being stopped, and who's being frisked, and so forth. And it's not that this is being driven by higher uses, prevalence rates of drug use among people of color. If anything, they are lower. With respect to marijuana, blacks and Latinos use marijuana slightly less than whites do. This is all based on NIDA-sponsored data collection and National Survey on Drug Use and Health. You can see for different prevalence intervals, the ever lifetime prevalence, last year prevalence, and the final two over there, last month prevalence. The pattern is the same, and these are old data I swiped from another presentation, but the data look the same now. And who gets arrested? They use drugs slightly less often, but they 3 or 4 times as likely in the same years to be arrested. Right? So the arrests and the discriminatory pattern of law enforcement is not based on prevalence, not based on use. And this is not really news. Crack offenders. If you look at the right pie chart, you can see that 2/3 of crack cocaine users are white, contrary to the kind of media stereotype, but over 3/4 of federal crack defendants are black. Now that's an outcome. That's not an accident of nature. Before and after, the crack laws really expanded the net, eliminated probation and parole and so forth. In '84, the proportion of federal offenders who were black was 10% by 1990. And again, the key laws passed in '86 and '88. And by 1990, it was almost triple that, at 28%. In '84, the average sentence for blacks was 28% higher than for whites. 1990, 49% higher. And this is the one I really wanted to get to. It's most sort of closely linked to our concerns here in this meeting. This was data that was available only because it was part of a lawsuit by the ACLU. If you look at the first set of bars, you can see that these are Maryland State Police on I-95 for a period of January '95 through September '96. And 76% of the people observed were white. 74%, the darker green, of the violators observed were white, roughly the same. 19% of the people stopped were white. If you look at blacks, it gets flipped. There are 17% of the people observed. There are 18% of the violators observed, roughly proportional, but there are 73% of the people who get stopped, right? There's no other way to explain this. Nothing to do with their behavior, the observations of the officers. It had to do with the race of the driver. So when I made this statement that, if new punishment-based policies are not used in a discriminatory fashion, it will be the first time. So it's, again, this is something to just keep in mind as you're formulating recommendations for new policies going forward. And let me end on a little bit lighter note. We only heard mention once today of DWT, which is what I call driving while texting, and the threat posed by smartphones. There were no smartphones when MAD began in the 1980s and started to really put impaired driving on the front pages and the front burner. But we now have a whole generation who've grown up with smartphones as if they were a natural appendage made of flesh. They're the principal means of communication for millions of people. They're constantly in hand, used for email, texting, tweeting, TV, movies, web browsing, shopping, and maybe most worryingly, traffic updates and directions. So I did an informal survey going down my one little street on my way from my house to downtown, and I looked at about 100 cars, and by my count, 11 of the 100 were doing this when they were driving, either texting or trying to get something, or looking at email, trying to make a call, whatever it was. So there's no drug involvement there, although there are people now in the addiction field, and perhaps Professor O'Brien can back me up on this, where they're starting to worry that these things can be habit forming. And if they're habit forming when you're driving down the street, that's a concern. And lastly, somebody did mention Uber and Lyft, and I noticed recently that people that I know have found it both much more convenient and cheaper when they're going out, particularly if they're driving, say, to downtown San Francisco, to use Uber instead. And there was a sort of lesson there when they're going out for the evening. And the lesson, seems to me, is, again, if the behavioral sciences can agree on nothing else, they seem to all agree that if you make it easier and cheaper to do the right thing, more people will do the right thing. So I don't know, that's a more positive thought to leave you with. So policies that support those kind of strategies seem likely to me, in the current conjuncture rather, to help further reduce driving fatalities. So I'll stop there.
Great.
Thank you very much.